Hello, everyone. This is the Prophet Michael David, aka Aries, and today we're going to talk about the Festival of Unleavened Bread. So, what is that? That's today. That is the proper name of what is most commonly known as Passover. Actually, Passover started last night. I'm not going to go into all the technical details, but just the basic ones. Passover is always the first full moon after the first new moon after the spring equinox. So basically, the first full moon after the spring equinox. And the full moon is called the Paschal full moon, which has to do with the Paschal lamb, which is the sacrifice for this night. But I'm not going to get into all that stuff. Instead, I'm just going to tell you a story of the first Passover, like with details, and and then at the end, I'm going to read just a little bit from Exodus exactly about this festival, Festival of Unleavened Bread, aka Passover, aka Pesach, and then that's it. Okay, the story of OG, the first festival of unleavened bread, aka Passover, and then as I tell it, you'll understand why they call it Passover instead of the festival on unleavened bread. But it starts back in Egypt around 3,300 years ago. So the Hebrews, the ancestors of the Jews, the Jewish people, were all slaves in Egypt, and they consisted of 12 tribes. Technically, it was 13. But one of those tribes was the tribe of Judah, and that's who all Jewish people descend from. So the start of this story is actually right at the end in the Bible of the 10 plagues, right before the 10th plague, which is the plague of the firstborn, which is technically chapter 11 in Exodus. And that's when God, who had called upon Moses, who wasn't from the tribe of Judah, he wasn't Jewish, he was Levite, he was from the tribe of Levi. He called upon Moses to tell the Hebrews that they were going to be leaving Egypt soon. And the Lord tells Moses, for the 10th and final plague, I'm going to send the angel of the Lord down upon Egypt and strike down the firstborn of all of them, both of their children and their livestock. And then God tells Moses, tell the Hebrews that so that does not happen to your firstborn and your firstborn livestock, you must sacrifice a lamb, the Paschal lamb, and smear its blood on the sides and the top of your doorstep. That way, when the angel of the Lord passes over Egypt, she will see the blood and not strike down your firstborn. So then the Hebrews wondered, which lambs should we slaughter to smear all over the doorstops? And they thought about it for a while, and they were like, the black ones, of course. Their wool is basically worthless. And then God told Moses that the Hebrews must always remember that time of year and that event in history when God led them out of Egypt. And to do that, they were to have a festival called the Festival of Unleavened Bread, where they would not eat bread with any yeast in it for 7 days. And that's what the thumbnail of this video is. It's the real thin, almost cracker-like bread. It's called matzah or matzo, and Jewish people eat a lot of it, and a whole lot of it during Passover. But the unleavened bread part of it has a much, much deeper meaning, which comes with the next part of the story. But you got to remember, this is OG Passover. This is actually the night before. And we've talked about how the ancients dealt with days. They didn't measure starts of days at midnight because they didn't have any way to tell time during the night. So they always counted days ending during sundown and days beginning during sun up. So then at midnight, what to them would be to seem to be the middle of the night, true OG Passover began, and the angel of the Lord came down upon Egypt and struck down all the firstborn of the Egyptians, and saw the blood on the doorstops and did not strike down the firstborn of the Hebrews. Now here comes the most important part of the story. but the part of the story that is most glossed over by most people, but the one I can tell you in depth the most about, is the morning after Passover, because Egypt was in chaos. Remember, things didn't get going until sunup because you didn't have any light. So right at sunlight, Moses is at the palace, and all the firstborn are dead in Egypt, including the Pharaoh's son. And Moses meets with the Pharaoh and is like, "Can we leave now?" And the Pharaoh was just so angry and enraged, and everyone probably thought he'd kill Moses, but he just said, "Go, go from Egypt and take your God with you, and just leave us be." And then Moses was like, "Oh, by the way, we need some gold too." And Pharaoh got even angrier, but didn't kill him, and said, "Okay, send out a decree, tell the people, give the Hebrews whatever they want as long as they get out of Egypt shortly thereafter." The Hebrews were just as terrified as the Egyptians. I mean, they'd seen all the other 9 plagues and everything, but they surely, and they did what Moses said and smeared the lamb's blood on their doorstops, but they didn't really believe that God was going to kill all the firstborn of Egypt and the Egyptians would slaughter them all. So they were just as terrified as the Egyptians. The only calm one was Moses. He was like, "I told you so. Pack up your stuff. We got to get out of here, like right now." And the gold thing might seem like Moses was vindictively rubbing salt in the wounds of Pharaoh, but he wasn't. It's because that was the resolution of a prophecy that God told Moses earlier in the Bible. I don't remember exactly which part. That when you do leave Egypt, you will plunder Egypt of its gold as well. And at that time, Moses was like, I mean, why would Pharaoh even let us go? And even if he did let us go, why would he give us a bunch of gold? But this was the fulfillment of the prophecy at this point. And now we get to the moment, the conjunction between the gold and the bread, and while they're both important to the story of OG Passover, is because shortly thereafter, the sun's still coming up or just a little bit off the horizon, and the Hebrews are frantically packing up all their stuff and, you know, just basically all the food and belongings that they can carry, and they start trudging out of Egypt. And the Egyptians are right there, Egyptian mothers and fathers holding their dead firstborn, just irate, just throwing Egyptian gold at them. Rings, necklaces, those little Egyptian scarab brooches, and a lot of them hit the Hebrews, because they're kind of getting stoned by them, and they fall down and they pick them up because that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to plunder Egypt. But some of them, they don't even have to do that because they hit the unleavened bread that's hanging around their necks like yolks because they didn't have time to bake the bread or even put the yeast in the bread. That's why it's unleavened, is because they didn't even have time to put yeast in the bread. So that's hanging around their necks like yolks, and all this Egyptian gold is hitting it. And of course, that's making their burden even heavier and heavier as they're trying to walk out of Egypt. And that is the true meaning of the conjunction between the two. They both plundered Egypt because it was prophecy, but they didn't want to. And the Egyptians hated them and wanted to hurt them, but so feared the Hebrew God at that time that they did not. Plus, the Pharaoh said, "Don't do that." And the Hebrews were just terrified. They were about to walk out into the desert with like very few supplies. And there was a lot of them, like 600,000. It could be, they always debate the number. It's probably more like 1,000,000, depending on passages later in the books. But yeah, it was just the craziest time ever. Everyone was terrified. The only one that isn't terrified is Moses. And so, why the Hebrews are gathering up all their stuff and getting all that gold thrown at him, he went to whatever temple held the sarcophagus of Joseph, eldest son of Raquel, and gathered up his bones as he promised to do, as Joseph was the one who prophesied the Exodus in the first place. And Moses gathered up his bones and he took them back to the camp and walked out into the desert with all the other Hebrews as commanded by God. Now, this brings us to a point where no matter what the words are in the book and everything, when you really look at the story, the Hebrews weren't led out of Egypt by Moses or even the Lord or even the angel of the Lord. God got the Hebrews kicked out of Egypt. That's what happened. They were kicked out of Egypt. Which brings me to my favorite part, or two favorite teaching parts right here at the end, is that there's a passage in the Bible where it says, and this is that moment when they're walking out into the desert that the Hebrews, Israelites, walked out into the desert looking for war. And what that means is that they knew that the word would get out that a bunch of slaves from Egypt had been freed or whatever, had run away, and that while the unleavened bread hanging around their necks was almost worthless to anybody, all the Egyptian gold sticking to it was not worthless. That was worth a whole lot. And so they went out into the desert looking for war because they knew somebody would eventually attack them. Which finally brings me to my favorite quote about this situation. And I don't know which Hebrew tells Moses this, but he says, and I quote, "Moshe, were there not enough graves in Egypt that you had to lead us out into the desert to die?" And that, my friends, is the true meaning of Passover and why it is truly called the Festival of Unleavened Bread. All right, now I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs that pertain to this very particular incident that I just spoke about. And from everything that I told you, it should all make sense. And yeah, so for all the Jewish people, happy Passover. And everybody else, I hope you learned something about Passover. Okay, so I'm just going to read a few paragraphs, and this is from chapter 12 in Exodus, which is titled The Passover and the Festival of Unleavened Bread. So here we go. "This is a day you are to commemorate for the generations to come. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance. For 7 days you are to eat bread made without yeast. On the first day, remove the yeast from your houses. For whoever eats anything with yeast in it from the first day through the 7th must be cut off from Israel. On the first day, hold a sacred assembly, and on another one on the 7th day. Do no work on all of these days, except to prepare food for everyone to eat. That is all you may do. Celebrate the festival of unleavened bread, because it was on this very day that I brought you and your divisions out of Egypt. Celebrate this day as a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. In the first month, you are to eat bread made without yeast, from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day. For 7 days, no yeast is to be found in your households, and anyone, whether foreign or native born, who eats anything with yeast in it must be cut off from the community of Israel. Eat nothing made with yeast. Wherever you live, must be eat unleavened bread." Then Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go at once and select the animals for your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into the blood into the basin, and put some of the blood on top and both sides of the door frame. None of you shall go out of the door of your home until the morning. When the Lord goes to the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on top and sides of the door frame and will pass over the doorway, and he will not permit the destroyer to enter your household and strike you down." And once again, that is the true meaning of Passover. All right, signing off. As always, rule number 1, do not touch other people without their consent, aka do not hurt each other. And rule number 2, it's all about honesty. Lies are ticked down, aka Try not to lie. All right. Happy Passover. I'll talk to you guys later.